Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 96 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin, that is Fia. And Fia, I don't know about you, but it is getting quite chilly up here
Oh
in
yeah.
uh, in yonder northeast,
Yep.
especially this week. Not as much where I live, although tonight when we're recording is going to be our first frost of the year.
Whoa.
Uh, but yeah, a bit more east and then up north where both of our families live is quite chilly right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's definitely southern chili down here. So uh
I like that southern chili.
yeah, it's southern chili. It was in the 50s all day today, so and
Oh,
very
okay.
windy. It was definitely painful to walk from the parking lot to my office because I just wore a cardigan and pants and was like, this will be enough, and it wasn't enough.
Yeah. No, it's been like that. Today was actually a little nicer because the sun came out for at least a little bit today. But yesterday, sometimes, especially on days when I don't wake up, a good hour or two before I have to be at work, I will usually forget to wear like an outer layer of clothes, like a hoodie or a jacket or something.
Yeah.
And yesterday I definitely forgot. And I was just walking around. It was like 50 degrees out, windy, no sun, just in a jeans and a t-shirt, and I was real cold.
Yeah, it's getting to that time of year.
But speaking of different areas of places, that's vaguely what we're talking about. That was my poor excuse for a segue. Today we're going to be talking about fossil laws around the world, which is interesting. I was really interested in a lot of the stuff about learning about this because I knew a bit about this,
Yeah,
but not too much before doing this episode. But before we get into all of that stuff, Fia, do we have some housekeeping things?
we do. So, once again, followers, I'm asking you to rate our show on whatever platform you listen to and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Give us feedback and any future topics that you would like to hear on the podcast. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, be sure to fill out our guest form. And all of these things can be found in the show notes.
Also, this is Gavin from the future because past Gavin always forgets to talk about what the next week's topic is while we're actually recording. But in honor of spooky season, next week we're going to be talking about bats and their, shall we say, less than ideal fossil history. So, if you're excited to learn more about bats in this most appropriate of seasons, let me know if you have any questions about bats or anything bat related. Make sure to reach out to us on the podcast on our YouTube channel or on Twitter. Awesome.
Yeah.
And so Mike is not here today, so that takes us right into our swamp corner. What do you have for
Yes.
that, Fia?
I will first start off with a joke.
Hit me.
What did the Pacific Ocean say to the Atlantic Ocean?
I don't know.
Nothing. It just waved.
That was rough. That was, but as per usual, the more groans a dad joke gets, the better the dad joke. So
Yes.
that was pretty solid.
Cool. And so for Swamp Corner, my little organism that I've chosen today is the feather blenny, Hypsoblennius hens. I think that's how you say the scientific name. If not, oh well.
That sounds right.
Yeah. These little guys are so cute. Please give a quick Google search if you see them. They look kind of like, I don't know how to describe it, but they have these cute little horns on the front of their face, and their cheeks are all swollen, and they look just kind of dumb and cute at the same time.
Yeah, no, I just googled it, and yeah, I like that. It's very much like an ugly cute.
Yeah, it's an ugly cute. It's an acquired taste, definitely. But yeah, these guys are found in the coasts of off the Atlantic and in the Gulf Coast, and obviously, or well, not obviously. I find them in my samples often, which is why I wanted to talk about
Okay.
them. They're highly reef associated, so definitely needing structure, and they're very often found on oyster reefs and rocky shores. They're oviparous, which means that they basically make eggs inside of their belly and then shoot them out without really any parental care. They're just kind of like, they're not hatched inside the animal, which is how most fish spread their eggs.
Right, but not all fish. There are a good handful. As with all things with fish, there are many exceptions that prove the rule.
Right. I don't know what the one fish is, but the really cool parental thing that I feel like I've only seen in Nemo or something like that is that like the baby fish will like go inside of like the mom's mouth.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then like,
I feel like there's a particular like group of fish that do that, but I don't know what they are.
Yeah, really cool. But these guys do not do that. They're basic.
Yeah.
And so they mostly eat crustacea, specifically amphipods, which is cool for me to learn for my project because I need to know who eats who. And that's pretty much all I got for my little feather blennies.
Awesome. And I was also kind of curious why they call them feather blennies, because they don't, maybe because of the horn things on their heads?
Yeah, I didn't really see anything why. I guess like their horn things, like maybe because they're feathery, but the Greek translation for like the root words in hypsoblennius, it was like I forgot the first part, but the second part was mucus, and I thought that was gross. Yeah.
So hypso, and I always, sometimes Greek and Latin use the same word for different things. Hypso typically, I think, means tall or long.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so, high. For example, the high, yeah,
that makes sense.
The Greek one is high. So high mucus.
Yeah, because that's Well, one of the ways that we classify teeth in especially mammals is you can have hypsodont teeth, which means that the crown, the part like above the gums, is longer than the root.
Okay.
That's really only the case in things like grazers, things like horses, cows, things like that.
That's actually really interesting because the feather blennies are a type of comb tooth blenny, which means that they have like comb-like teeth. And I wonder if it has if the hypso part of the name has anything to do with the dental structure in their mouth, like you were talking about.
I don't know. I'm not an ichthyologist. I'd have to ask.
Just some pondering to think about.
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry this didn't transition well into the fossil laws around the world.
No, that's okay. But yeah, so obviously, more or less every country on the planet has fossils. I'm sure that there are some, like very small countries that don't. But by and large, you'd be really hard-pressed to find a country with no fossils in them whatsoever. Which makes sense. Rocks are common. Everywhere you go, there are rocks.
They do be common.
And because of that, because fossils are so ubiquitous, most countries have some kinds of laws about especially the export of fossils, but also just the general collection. Joe Schmo off the street. You see a fossil out in the dirt and you go pick it up. In some countries, that's totally fine. In other countries, that's extremely illegal. So I thought it'd be fun to just go over a handful of them, because obviously we do not have time to go over fossil laws in every country in the world.
That could be its own podcast.
It sure could. I don't know who would listen to that, because I wouldn't listen to that whole podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we'll go over a handful of countries, especially that most people at least could probably point to on a map. I don't think any of these countries will be anything too niche or anything. Most countries kind of fall into one of two categories, and we'll kind of break that down later in the episode. So first, let's talk about the U.S., since that's where we currently live and where this podcast is coming at your ears from. So I also want to talk about it first because the U.S. is very weird in many ways, in a lot of things, but particularly fossil laws in this case. American culture is very especially with land. This thing is mine. You don't get to tell me what to do with it.
Common theme of the U.S.
Yeah. So that also translates a lot to the various laws around fossils. So fossil collecting is legal just about everywhere in the United States. If it is on your land, if you find it, it is yours to do whatever you want to do with it. You could destroy it. You could put it on display out somewhere just in your yard or something. Or, as many people tend to do, you can sell it.
And
even
how do you feel
export
about
it out of the
that?
country. How do I feel?
Yeah, like as a paleontologist.
I don't love it.
Yeah. Why?
As we'll talk about, I'll talk a little bit more about it when we talk about some other countries because they are very different. But I'm also a realist, and I know that this is very deeply ingrained in the culture of the United States, and that's not going to change.
Gotcha.
So, and because of this, because of how easy it is to say, hey, this fossil, I found it in my yard, or if you own like a ranch, particularly out west, if you find this on your, couple 100-acre ranch, you can pay somebody to come dig it up and sell it. Or if you own that 100, 200-acre ranch and you don't want any of the fossils on it, somebody could come ask you, hey, can I come check out your land for fossils? Can I come collect fossils from your property? And most people would work out some kind of agreement where it's like, yeah, but if you do, I get 10% of whatever you sell. Sure. Because of this, those kinds of deals are extremely common, and commercial fossil collecting and dealing is a huge market in the United States, particularly in states like South Dakota, Colorado, Utah, Montana, the western, like central western states. And that is all the case for private land. Things get a little different when we talk about public lands.
Okay.
And, also, as a quick side note, there are some extremely rare cases for strange, arcane legal reasons where you don't actually own the mineral rights to your land. Right. So other countries might not have to deal with this. So if you are a listener from a different country, you might not know about this, but the use of the land depends, like who is able to do what with the land depends on what you're doing with it. So for example, you can sell off the mineral rights to your land, which means, say there's an oil company that says, hey, I want to explore your property for oil to see if there's any oil underneath the boundaries of your land. You can sell the mineral rights to that land, or a mine would be a similar thing. And that person cannot like open a store or other things like that, or build a house on it because you didn't sell those rights to your land. You only sold the mineral rights. And then if that person then sold the land itself, the new owner would still not be the owner of the mineral rights. That would still belong to the oil company or the mine company that bought those rights. Again, very strange. Very few other countries actually do stuff like this. But there was actually just a couple years ago, in 2020, in Montana, the U.S. District Court in Montana ruled that fossils are not included under mineral rights ownership because I think like a mining company or an oil company found some fossils and were like, we own the mineral rights to this land. These are ours.
Oh.
And the landowner was like, no, no, no.
These are mine.
Exactly. And it made it all the way up to the U.S. District Court, which is interesting. So as of 2 years ago, at the recording of this podcast, fossils they go under the general land ownership, not mineral rights, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is.
Right. Circling back to the difference between private and federal land, if you had to guess, what percentage of U.S. land is federally owned?
What percentage?
Because it's probably more than you think.
I want to say like 70%.
Owned by the federal government?
Oh. So that does not.
Yeah, so this is all
Less.
federal, not including like state or especially, private.
Okay, so let's say like 30%.
Pretty close, about 28.
Nice. Oh, so close.
Yeah, so all of this 28% of land almost exclusively like west of the Rockies pretty much. So Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona make up the vast majority of that land. And on these properties, it depends which federal agency has jurisdiction there, which is weird. Again, no other country really does stuff like this, which is why I'm taking so long to explain it, because the U.S. is just incredibly strange in the way we do everything. So, in places that are run by the National Park Service, such as national parks, absolutely no collecting. You cannot find a fossil in a national park and pocket that. That is a federal crime. So, do not. We've had an entire episode about national parks and how they belong to everybody.
Yeah.
So, however, even though that same principle should apply to other federal lands, because the whole point of them being owned by the federal government is that they belong to everybody, just like national parks, if the land is under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Land Management or the U.S. Forest Service, generally, it's okay to collect plant fossils or invertebrate fossils up to about 10 pounds per day. And I feel like that was a fairly recent change. Last I knew it was 25 pounds a day. But
wow.
Yeah. And that is all for personal use. You can't sell those fossils. You can go and collect just for fun or just to keep in your own collection, but you cannot sell them with one exception, and that's petrified wood for some reason.
Can we get a recap of what petrified wood is?
Sure. So it is, wood that is, was buried underground, and then all of the actual, biotic, life-made parts of the wood were replaced by minerals, usually quartz. So it is very hard, very dense, and typically very pretty. For whatever reason, they tend to really get a lot of these kind of reddish, orangish colors. So they can be very pretty, and if it's a big enough piece, very valuable because it is so pretty.
Yeah.
But for some reason, petrified wood, if you find that on federal land and it's under your 10 pounds of rocks per day, then yeah, you can sell that all you want, which is strange to me. Because even if you found like a leaf fossil, because, that's still a plant, you can't sell that.
Right. Is petrified wood something like really rare to come across?
No, it's extremely common, which is probably the point also.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I would say it's very common in certain places. So it's not, totally widespread, but it's where there is petrified wood, you're basically tripping over it all over the place. The place where I was doing all my work in the desert when I was on construction sites and stuff, we found thousands of pieces of petrified wood that we didn't even bother collecting unless it was over about 30 pounds or so. which is a big piece of wood to find in the desert.
Cool.
Yeah. So that is generally how the United States works with fossils. At least collecting. Exporting is pretty much, completely open. There are really no rules as for exporting or importing fossils so long as they were collected legally. And again, the reason why I spent so much time talking about the US is because it has such a complex system of private ownership versus public ownership versus public ownership but in private collections versus mineral rights, etc. There's so much ambiguity, which is why there are quite a lot of legal cases around fossils.
Yeah.
And one last time to reiterate, it is very rare that countries are this loose about their fossils.
Gotcha.
The US is just a bunch of weirdos, but I feel like we all kind of knew that by now.
Yeah.
And to reiterate how weird the United States is, let's take a look at our neighbor to the north, Canada.
Ooh.
And Canada kind of depends on its province. I don't think there are all that many national Canadian laws, but a lot of them, each province tends to have its own, which is much simpler because there are many fewer provinces than there are states in the United States.
Yeah.
But in general, across all of the provinces, no collecting in state or Canada's version of, or I guess, provincial or national parks, which kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
But the couple of the province that we're going to mainly talk about here is Alberta, which is sort of in the same part of Canada. It is just north of like North Dakota and Montana. So the middle section of Canada.
Okay.
And there are extremely famous fossils there, very similar to the fossils you would find in Montana and the Dakotas. In Alberta, however, all fossils belong to the province. All of them.
Wow.
Yeah. Regardless of where you found it. If you found it out in your yard, on land that you own, that fossil, no matter what kind of fossil it is, whether it is a vertebrate, an invertebrate, a plant, whatever, that belongs to the province.
Did you find
Which is,
any reason for why Alberta is just like really putting the hammer down?
I think it's because they have such good fossils.
Okay. Yeah. They're like, yeah, that makes sense.
Alberta does kind of a strange thing, though. So even though they all belong to the province, if it is not a vertebrate fossil, so not a thing with bones, you can collect it. And you can keep it in your own personal collection. But technically, at any point, the government of Alberta could show up and take their fossils because they are theirs.
Do people have to register them? How would they know?
That's a wonderful question. To my knowledge, no.
Okay.
But, similar to however law enforcement learns anything, I'm sure if somebody just had a giant stash of fossils, I'm sure that would get out somehow.
Right.
Again, and that's totally fine to do. If you live in Alberta and have thousands of, I don't know, trilobites or, fossil bivalve shells, those are completely fine to have and collect and totally fine. As long as you know that those don't technically belong to you and you can't sell them because they don't belong to you.
Right.
Small caveat there is that you can't excavate them. You can only find them on the surface. So it's like, say you find a piece of petrified wood that is like a tree branch that there's a foot of it above ground and a foot of it below ground. Sorry, you can't dig it out. Even though that is not a vertebrate, you cannot dig it out. No digging at all.
Could you alert?
Also in Alberta, Yeah, it is. It is strange. That is
Okay.
also technically rule in some of the federal lands in the United States too. Even the things you are allowed to collect, you can't dig for.
Okay.
Yeah. Uh, Alberta also has a couple other weird quirks because there are 4 types of fossils that you can legally find and belong to. You have to find them, and then you can like submit a thing to be like, "Hey, I want to own this myself." And the 4 types of fossils that count are ammonite shells, ammonites being, as we've previously called them, the swirly shelled squid boys,
Yes.
petrified wood, unsurprisingly, leaf impressions, and oysters.
Whoa, that's so cool.
Yeah, not sure why they specify oysters instead of just any bivalve, but here we are. Uh,
Yeah. Uh,
um,
that is weird.
and a
I
little,
guess oysters are less special
yeah,
than other bivalves, maybe?
I'm not sure. And I've never, granted, I don't pay much attention to oyster paleontology. Gasp, I know.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know if there are, if, fossil oysters are particularly common in Alberta.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you.
Mhm.
So, and because of all of these protections in Alberta, it is extremely illegal to export fossils, any kind of fossil, but especially vertebrate fossils, out of Alberta. However, as a fun personal note, I happen to be extremely lucky in that when I was still in the habit of buying fossils, before I learned that that's not the best practice, especially for a paleontologist,
Yeah.
um, I happen to have bought legally a ceratopsian toe bone. So ceratopsians being like triceratops and such.
Whoa.
That was from Alberta, that was collected before these laws were passed, and so was sort of grandfathered in so it could be sold with a specific identification number.
Hmm.
Um, so I have all the legal documentation for it, but I have this little toe bone chilling in my office in my university.
What year did you buy that?
What year did I buy that? I want to say 2017.
Okay. So these laws are pretty new.
So it was collected and exported
Oh,
before then.
gotcha.
Yeah. So when it was actually collected, I'd have to look. There is the documentation for that, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Right. I gotcha.
So that is one particular province in Canada, but that is the most extreme. Other provinces, such as Ontario, where there's really not many vertebrate fossils, Ontario is much more similar to the United States. But all the other provinces are kind of on a spectrum between Alberta and similar to the United States. Running through some more rapid fire countries here. Next up, we're going to just briefly mention the United Kingdom and also the EU. The United Kingdom has not been separated from the EU long enough to establish fossil exportation laws. So, as
Okay.
far as I know, with all of Brexit things. So, I think with fossils, it's generally quite similar to the United States in the United Kingdom. Not really
Hmm.
surprised there. Most of the general laws and things of the United States are based in what's called English common law. Not going to go into exactly what that is, but um, and in the EU in general, it is generally fine to collect and export fossils as long as you can actually do that in the area. So similar thing, no parks, things like that.
Okay.
So moving on to some other countries that are much more famous now for their paleontology. So England especially is extremely famous in like the history of the study of paleontology, but some much more recent big players in paleontology are countries like Brazil. Brazil is much less complicated than the United States or Canada or the quagmire that is the EU. And it's much more simple because as of 1942, all fossils are the property of the state and cannot be sold or exported at all, with extremely few exceptions.
Nice.
Also, as of 1990, fossils found in Brazil that are researched must be published on or that are published on must have a collaborator from a Brazilian institution. Basically, it sort of helps keep fossils in the place where they're from, in the appropriate geological and regional context,
Yeah.
and part of their local heritage, because people like fossils.
Yep.
And when you take fossils away from people, they can get mad.
Yeah. I'm actually, I've seen some of that been going on with places um, like the Bahamas for like biological
Mm.
samples,
Mm-hmm.
where there's like, they put in place all these new permits and like payments that you have to do to like do research in the Bahamas, and they favor people within the Bahamas and discount those people for collecting samples and such to basically do the same thing of keeping like
Mm-hmm.
the biological science within the country, which
Exactly. And that's something that I think is really important,
yeah.
because there's what's called parachute science is historically very popular.
Hmm.
Basically, scientists from wealthier countries going into less wealthy countries and taking their things with them when they find them.
Yeah.
Um, Unfortunately for Brazil, these laws have not typically been all that well enforced, with the exception of very high profile cases. Um, in the last handful of years, that's sort of started to change, thankfully. Uh, Many Brazilian fossils have been taken and exported even after 1942, when these laws were passed, and they currently sit in museums all over the world. No wealthy country is innocent of this, but the ones that have been causing the most sort of recent attention have been a handful of large museums in Germany. We've
Oh.
talked about one particular fossil called Ubirahara, which is a early, very unique dinosaur that is the only one of its kind that we have found.
Hmm.
That just recently, in the last, I think, like 6 months or so, is supposedly being returned to Brazil after a large, you know, internet thing, internet commotion from the paleontology community. I've
Hmm.
yet to see too much follow up as to whether that has happened yet or not.
Right.
Um, but that is one of the few and far between cases. Many, 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 the vast majority of fossils exported after it was illegal still sit in museums around the world.
Gotcha.
Moving on to another country here. Next, we have South Africa, which I saw in a handful of places have sort of the best defined laws, where it is extremely clear what you can and can't do, unlike the United States, where we always have to be suing each other over what we can and can't do. And that's probably because fossils generally cannot even be collected without a permit. Uh, in order to collect any fossil, you need a permit from uh, I don't know if it was like a federal or regional agency. And all collected fossils also belong to the state, like they do in Brazil. Um, However, they do say that fossils can be exported to museums or universities only. So, getting a permit and exporting them to a museum or a university, totally fine. Unlike in Brazil, where I think that in general, that is just not how Brazil wants their fossils handled.
What do you mean?
So Brazil wants them all to stay within the borders of the country, whereas South Africa is like, well, if it's going to a museum or a
Okay.
university, that's fine.
Right. Okay. I was when you said that, I was thinking like just transported, not actually exported outside of the country. But yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah, no, understood.
Yeah, so if there were some fossils found in South Africa, and say my university, for one reason or another, here in Pennsylvania in the US, wanted to get one of those fossils loaned to us or to put on display or for research, South Africa would generally, we'd have to go through a long permit process, but generally would probably be able to make that happen. Brazil would not tolerate that. They would not want that.
Gotcha. Okay.
the next country is one that I actually include only because of a fun few anecdotes here, which is Mongolia.
Oh,
As of 1924, same in general as Brazil and South Africa, all fossils are government property. But I also, like I said, there's a couple of anecdotes. One of my coworkers here at the university is from Mongolia. And
oh,
in a conversation that I've had with him about what I used to do working on the construction sites in the desert, sort of talking about the differences between fossil collecting on private and federal land, as complicated as you now know it is, he was like, interesting. Private land ownership really isn't a thing in Mongolia.
wow. Really?
So not even, private collecting of fossils, just private land ownership in general is. I did look up a little more about it for this episode.
Hmm.
It's very complicated, but the whole concept of private ownership of land is a very new concept in Mongolia, and the vast
Okay.
majority of land in the country belongs to the government, which is extremely weird to wrap your head around as somebody who lives in the United States.
Yeah, definitely.
Also, I wanted to include it because of this fun quirk. In 2015, there was a controversy involving the actor Nicolas Cage having to return a skull that he bought that was illegally smuggled out of Mongolia. And it more or less was the government being like, hey, we know you have this thing. We can come get it, or you can donate it back and we'll graciously take it and thank you. And he was like, okay, yeah, I'll donate it.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, what else do you
um,
do?
exactly. And it was a skull of a very closely related dinosaur to T-Rex. Extremely similar. Some people say they should even be in the same genus, but very T-Rex-like dinosaur. And he just had a whole skull for whatever rich people buy fossils for.
I mean, what any people buy fossils for.
Right, but it's like, I personally, what do I need a T-Rex skull for?
I mean, what do you need one of those toes for?
You know, that's a very fair question. Nowadays, and my whole thought process with when I was actively buying fossils,
Yeah.
for myself, was to, at that point, I still planned on going to get my PhD, and I was going to use them as like teaching stuff.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
was my goal
Yeah.
personally.
Yeah.
I feel like that is very few and far between, though.
Yeah. No, I wasn't trying to at you or anything. I just,
No, I know.
I think, I don't think it has to be just like rich people based, but I do see that rich people sometimes buy things frivolously.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. So we're going to go over only a couple more countries and then sort of why I'm talking about this in general. So the next two are, if you are in the market of buying fossils, you almost certainly. So if you have like a somewhat decent sized collection, I guarantee you have fossils from one or both of these countries. So the first one is Morocco. So Morocco is a
Mm.
country most Americans, I'll say, Americans are not particularly good at geography. So it is in northwestern Africa. So it's just south of Spain. And Morocco has a massive exporting industry, and I would be surprised if less than a third of all available fossils, like, if you were to go to eBay or some fossil selling website, I would be surprised if a third of them, if less than a third, were from Morocco.
Wow.
So many fossils come out of Morocco.
Is that like
And they
a
have all sorts.
is
Oh, go
that
ahead.
like a booming like economic industry for them?
Very much so.
Okay.
In the areas where there are a lot of fossils, it is generally pretty deserty. So not a whole lot in the way of other economic opportunities for the people who do dig up the fossils. So Morocco's laws are ambiguous generally. Yeah.
How so?
So technically, a couple of sources that I found were like, it is technically illegal for people to be collecting and selling these fossils. It is not illegal to buy them, but it is depending on how the laws are defined, because the phrasing I believe that they use is objects of anthological, so like time, or archaeological interest. So depending on how you consider fossils, that does or does not apply.
Yeah.
And like I said, the people in Morocco, at least the government, seems to not particularly care because it is such an economic opportunity.
Yeah.
However, something that we'll circle back to in a little bit is that Morocco is one of the signatories of, in 1970, so UNESCO, which is a UN sub-organization. So if you've ever heard of a World Heritage Site, UNESCO is who governs those. Signed basically a convention that basically makes it, all the countries that sign it agree to not import or export or promote the sale of cultural heritage objects, which generally is considered to include fossils. So technically they shouldn't be doing this, but like I said, people in those areas don't have much else for economic opportunity.
Okay.
So it's like, well, if those people have to sell fossils to not starve, then I'm, that's fine on my conscience.
Yeah.
The other country that I'd like to talk about, the last one, is Madagascar, which most Americans probably only know from the movie, featuring the talking animals and the lemurs.
King Julian.
So it is exactly King Julian. So Madagascar is a large island off the eastern coast of southern Africa. And they have some kind of strange fossil laws. I couldn't really find much in the way of like domestic laws about like collecting. So as far as I know, it is kind of free reign to just, if you find a fossil in a place you're allowed to be and you collect it, that's fine, I think. The strange part is the exporting laws. It is illegal to export vertebrate fossils. So again, things with bones. However, invertebrates are fine to export, but you have to prepare them and sort of make them look pretty first. Yeah.
They can't have low quality invertebrates coming out of their country.
Exactly. And yeah, I believe it, because the fossils coming out of Madagascar are beautiful. Particularly a lot of their ammonites. Something that you'll see a lot is ammonites sort of cut in half. So you get two halves. And typically with ammonites, so they make their shells in these chambers that, when the animal is alive, are filled with gas, and it lets them move sort of up and down in the water, sort of like how a submarine can move up and down. When the animal dies and is buried, those get filled in with different minerals. And just like that petrified wood from earlier, they can look very pretty if you cut them open and polish them and make them look really nice. So if you ever see some very pretty looking ammonites, they probably came from Madagascar.
Maybe so.
And now, sort of wrapping everything together, as I sort of looked through, this is just a very small sample of all the countries that I sort of looked at, I kind of noticed a pattern in that countries that generally have been historically exploited tend to have stricter laws about their fossils.
Yeah.
Places like the US and the UK, kind of free reign. And a lot of parts of, places like Canada, lots of free reign. Places like Brazil and South Africa, very much the opposite. And this might just be me obviously I don't want to put words in the mouths of other countries, but I feel like it's just the general sense of they got tired of rich countries coming in and taking their stuff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, sometimes that's what it comes down to.
Yeah. And so that sort of brings me back to that UNESCO convention that I mentioned earlier. So the full name is the 1970 Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Prevention of the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. It's a very long title. It's the only time I'm going to use
it. UNESCO. Oh, wait,
Exactly.
that's not what it is.
No, that's the overall organization, which, one moment please, stands for
the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization.
Thank you.
It's in your notes.
Is it? Oh, you right. Future Gavin, edit this out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it stands for that. And this convention has been ratified, signed, approved by whatever by 142 countries.
Wow.
Which is only like 30 or 40 less than all the countries.
Okay.
Yeah, so this has been signed by just about everybody. And it basically says that all the different countries that have signed this should take measures in order to, protect their cultural heritage. Generally,
right.
Most people would associate this with things like archaeological artifacts, things, like how we see, for example, here in the U.S., Native American artifacts in every museum. Those, most of the time, those didn't get given to the museum. And that's sort of, a self-contained thing. But, this particularly applies to the export. And generally, most people sort of agree that this also should include fossils.
Right.
And so, again, if you can name a country, it almost certainly was one that signed this. I did a quick scroll through, and there were no countries that immediately came to my mind that I'm like, this country isn't here. But particularly, all the countries that I've listed here have, including places like the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, most of the European Union. So, something to think about if you happen to be in the market to buy fossils. The United Nations says that if it's from a different country, you probably shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
And
so you weren't able to find like a list of like the rebels that have not signed it, or it just was like they were all the main ones were accounted for?
Right. It was just a list of who did and when.
Mm-hmm.
Because like I said, this was, the convention itself was in 1970, and countries can still sign it, to this day. The most recent signature was Turkmenistan.
Wow.
As of January of just this past year, so less than a year ago.
Nice.
So, yeah, 52 years after, this convention happened, any of those 30 to 40 holdouts can absolutely still join this, and I feel like they should.
Yeah. And maybe one day they will.
I hope so.
Me too.
Yeah, I really hope. And just circling back a little bit to your question sort of at the beginning of my personal thoughts on fossil collecting is a little bit of sort of you calling me out where it's like, why do you need that?
Right.
With certain things, I just think it's neat.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a totally acceptable answer,
Yeah, for sure.
But with other things, it's like, why do you want to own something that has significant scientific value?
Right.
Because some random trilobite you found, or some ammonite that you got from Madagascar, probably generally very little scientific value from that individual fossil.
Yeah.
However, things like that Nicolas Cage skull,
Mhm.
there's only a handful of those.
Yeah.
And so every new one is incredibly important for scientists to be able to study. And something that either a lot of people who buy a lot of significant fossils don't realize is that scientists, at least most paleontologists, will not study things in private collections.
Why is
And that's
that?
not, yeah, so it's not because, they're trying to be uppity and be like, oh, this should be in a museum like Indiana Jones. It's just sort of a fundamental thing that one of the main tenets of science is that it needs to be repeatable so that other people can check your work.
Yeah.
And if it's in a private collection where one single individual gets to say, I like these scientists, they can study it.
Hmm.
You called me a funny name once, or you looked at me wrong, and you don't get to.
Gotcha.
So it's just a fundamental, this is not how we think this should be done in order for us to do good science.
Yeah.
So, in general, fossil buying, fine, but maybe ask yourself a question of, do I really need this? Or something that I've actually found recently is, so last week for National Fossil Day, our students in our geology department here put out a nice fossil display, and there were a couple fossils that I thought would be neat if we had them. Particularly a
Hmm.
couple things from the Ediacaran period, which is when we had a bunch of weird animals that we don't really know what they are, right before animals evolved hard parts. So,
Okay.
very long ago, very strange looking animals. But the fossils are very rare and obviously extremely hard to get your hands on if you don't work at a major museum. So I sort of went exploring and found that several types of these fossils have 3D models freely available online.
Wow.
So I
That's
went
awesome.
to one of our 3D printing labs and I 3D printed some up.
Wow. That's awesome of you.
Yeah, so I think that's a super, obviously 3D printing is
Yeah.
can be kind of expensive,
Hmm.
but if you want to just have a fossil to look at, I would look into that because I think it would be way cheaper. Number
Yeah.
one, and you're not extracting cultural heritage from a different area,
Right.
personally. So,
And so I was thinking about what you said about how generally, like, you don't do science on private fossil collections. And
mhm.
I was thinking before you even said like the 3D printing, if there was some way to make the private fossil collections open access after some one person like gets access to them. But I don't really know what kind of complications you'd run into trying to do that.
Right. I feel like it would be even something, so with paleontology in particular, and this might be getting a little too in the weeds, but it's at the end of the episode, so I
Yeah,
don't
why
really mind.
not?
Um, so paleontology is a very descriptive science,
Mhm.
because there are certain things that you just kind of have to accept that we will likely never know about an animal,
Mhm.
and so we just have to describe as much as we can, and then make inferences based off of that. So,
Okay.
particularly the first time like a new species is discovered, um, there are thousands of individual like measurements taken,
Mhm.
and it might seem kind of trivial that you're just going out there with a ruler, but different ratios between different body parts can tell you different things about the ecology of how that animal lived. And so needing to have multiple groups of scientists take those measurements, you could just say, well, this, they got this published, it must be good enough, right? Well, so if someone's like, well, this ratio seems off for what group of, say, for example, we'll use dinosaurs. So they say it's a tyrannosaur, in the same group as, T-Rex and such. They say that this body part is this long and this other body part is this long. The ratio between those seems weird. I would like to measure that myself, just to make sure that they measured it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Again, a very niche scenario, but paleontology is very niche science. And with private collectors, that kind of access is not guaranteed.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's kind of a very uniquely paleontology problem. Right. Because if you were a zoologist studying modern animals, the odds of a person having the only known one of a new species is extraordinarily rare.
Yeah.
Because if it's rare enough for someone to buy it like that, it's probably, I don't know, I just can't really think about that kind of thing happening. That doesn't seem like it would make sense in my brain,
Yeah. I can't really think of a situation either.
Yeah, I tried to come up with a hypothetical there, and then my brain was like, no. Plus, it's also late, and my brain is just about most things right now.
And with that, I think that we had a great podcast episode.
Exactly. This has been episode 96 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. Let me know all of your thoughts about fossil laws around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And note to Gavin for later, come up with what we're doing next week and put that at the beginning of this episode.
Right.
And we will see you all next week with whatever the topic is. This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.